Everyone. So this is a tutorial on Modelbuilder. It's just an introduction to Modelbuilder. The point behind Modelbuilder is to make GIS do multiple steps for you that you've already planned out. You tell it what tools to execute and what order to execute them, so that you don't have to keep repeating the same thing over and over again individually in those multiple steps. Makes things a lot easier to keep track of and faster, especially when you end up with 10 or 20 or whatever different steps, and you want to change one thing in the middle of them, the size of something or the length or whatever it is, that would then necessitate modifying all of the subsequent steps. If you have a model set up, then you can change that really easily and just run the whole thing again. So that's what we're gonna do today. For those of you who have taken the Intro GIS class at UMass, the NRC 585 or GEO 593, this data set will look familiar to you. This is the infamous dead bird lab from lab 3, dealing with all of the geoprocessing. Before we can start with a model, we need to first figure out what the steps are in terms of the process that we want to execute. So this is in the dead bird lab, the scenario is that there's a dead bird, the red dot in the middle, that has been identified carrying West Nile virus. And that there is a scenario where the CDC requires that the state go out and spray for other mosquitoes, and they must get all the area that they can within 2 kilometers of where the dead bird was found. So basically a 2-kilometer circle surrounding the dead bird. The problem is that the spray truck can only drive on roads, which are the brown things on here, and the spray for mosquitoes only goes 50 meters away from roads. So it can only reach 50 meters. And then the other problem is that because of wetland laws, they are not allowed to spray directly within the wetland areas or within 100 meters of a wetland area. And so the challenge in this problem is to identify how much spray area are we actually going to get? What are all the areas that are within 2 kilometers of the dead bird that are reachable, so within 50 meters on either side of the roads, but not within 100 meters of a wetland. So if you haven't done this problem, or even if you have, take a second, pause the video to work through those steps of how to do that. And the tools that you're probably going to want to refresh yourself on are buffers, right? Because we're going to want a shape of 2 kilometers surrounding the dead bird. We're going to want a shape of 50 meters on either side of the roads and a shape of 100 meters around and including the wetlands. The other piece that you want to refresh yourself on is the clip, right? That's a pretty basic tool that you're probably familiar with, which is basically the cookie cutter. So if you wanted to just look at the road buffer that's within 2 kilometers of the dead bird, clipping the road buffer that's going to be much broader than 2 kilometers to that 2 kilometer shape might be a good plan. And then the other piece, which is sort of the inverse of a clip, is the erase tool, which you probably want to refresh yourself on as well. That's where you can remove a polygon from another polygon shape. So for example, for the wetlands area, if you want to remove that from the overall, road spray area, erase would be a good candidate to do that. Okay, so now if you're back from having put your sort of steps together and thought about it, and maybe even executed each of those so that you have a total spray area within this scenario, let us go ahead and execute. Let's do those steps in Modelbuilder. Modelbuilder in ArcPro is found under the analysis, and there's a little Modelbuilder symbol up there. In Arc Desktop, this is the Modelbuilder symbol right here. So you just click on that, you'll get a similar sort of blank screen that pops up. in our case, so in Arc Desktop, it'll be like a new window that pops up. In Arc Pro, it's a new tab that pops up. So let's start with the main things that we need to do in terms of the geoprocessing to get these steps. So let me find the tools that I need. Okay, so buffer is already in here because that's a commonly used tool. So all I need to do is find the tool in, it has to start from the geoprocessing window over here and drag it into Modelbuilder. And now my tool is in Modelbuilder. And now I can double click on the buffer and it opens up that window that should look familiar in terms of what a buffer looks like when you do it just by clicking on buffer and geoprocessing. So in this case, let's start with the dead bird. And let us create a distance of, I think it was 2 kilometers is what we said. There's only one dot, one point here, so there's no need to dissolve it. That doesn't matter. And as soon as I put in the input features and whatever selections I need to make so that it's fully executable, GIS will turn this into these 3 colors. So we've got our input, we have our tool, and we have our output, the dead bird buffer. I could change, it's best to go in this way. So you can always change the output to something else if you didn't like dead bird buffer, just like you could in your regular execution of the buffer tool. So we knew we needed a buffer around the dead bird. We know that we also need buffers around the roads and around the wetlands. The roads, that was 50 meters from a road that we could reach. In this case, the dissolve type does matter. So remember, a dissolve, if you have a bunch of different road segments and they're overlapping, if you want to keep the attributes of each of those individual roads and the buffer around them, then no dissolve is the way to go. If all you care about is the shape, though, then dissolving them just makes the thing look cleaner ultimately. And if you're counting area, if you care about the overall area of this road buffer, then dissolving is important because you won't double count, you know, sort of buffer overlap areas where you have different road segments intersecting. So I'll do the dissolve all. And our last buffer is the wetlands, right? And this one is a unit of 100 meters that we don't want to include in our spray. I'm going to use the dissolve all again because I just want a shape. I don't care about the names of the individual wetlands, and I don't want to have to worry about any overlap of buffer area across different wetland features. For this particular process, it doesn't really matter too much, but I don't like worrying about things even if I think they don't matter. So I'm going to make those 3 buffers. Okay, next thing that we would want to do for the dead bird, right? We have this dead bird shape that we're creating, and we also have a road shape. So the roads are the areas that we want to spray, but we don't want to go and spray roads that are outside of that 2 kilometers from the dead bird, right? So that's where our clip comes in. And again, we're just dragging that in. There's a slight difference in, so Arc Pro is a little bit nicer in terms of recognizing these output files as potential input files. So you can see that there are a bunch of model variables down here. So I don't want to go with my original point line polygon here. I actually want to go with, you know, my input features is my road buffer, and I want to use the cookie cutter of the dead bird buffer to create my roads buffer clip. That's a really nice feature in Arc Pro. Let me just go over to desktop for a second because it looks a little bit different the way that desktop works. Let's find. lab 3, here it is. My goodness, it's a lot of digging down into subfolders. Okay, so here's the same data set. Let me zoom out a little bit, that we saw on the other one. In Arc Desktop, we can do the same things. So let's find our buffer. And let me just put in this case, the dead bird. So you can skip through this part if you're working in Pro. Doing the same thing. Just do 2,000 meters. Okay. And then I want my buffer for my roads of 50 meters. And I want it to dissolve all. All right, so let's find our clip analysis. It's almost identical in Arc Desktop as it is in Arc Pro. It's just that it's not like organized quite the same, and these little like recycling signs are not super intuitive, that these are outputs that are in the model. So that's what the recycling sign means, that this is a feature that's inside the model. So this shapefile doesn't exist yet, but you can still use it in the model because Modelbuilder knows that it will exist. It's an output from your model. So if I wanted to clip my roads buffer with my dead bird buffer, that's how you do it in desktop. It's almost the same as in Pro. And it should sort of link these different things up in there. Okay, I'm going to put that on my other screen. Right, the only difference was that Arc Pro kind of nicely says model variables down below, and rather than having some strange symbol that isn't totally intuitive as to what's going on. So what you want are the model variables. You want to work with those after you've created an output here. You can work with these outputs as the next thing along. Okay, so I have now, this file should be my roads buffer, so everything that's a polygon within 50 meters of a road and also within 2 kilometers of the dead bird. From that, I want to take away, so I want to erase the wetlands buffer. Come on. So I need to make sure that I am putting in my roads buffer clip, right? The last thing in the line down here, and I'm taking away my wetlands buffer. At which point I'll basically have my final thing. So rather than calling this roads buffer clip erase, even though that might be perfectly intuitive to you guys, I'm going to call this spray area. It's my final thing. So one nice thing about Modelbuilder, now I have this kind of mess going here. There is an auto layout. This is true in Arc Pro. It's also true in Arc Desktop, where it'll just like organize all this stuff for you to make it look a little less like crazy. So if I execute this, and I'm going to do that in a second, then I should, at the end of this, get, this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-step process, right? That if I did each of those step by step, there's a chance that I'm going to mess something up or like do it in the wrong order or whatever it is. This way, as long as I've got my workflow, right? So this would be awesome as a figure for your workflow for your next lab. Well, not this exactly. But once I've got this in my workflow, I can save it here, I can come back to it, I can adjust things later on. You can also add fields. So if I wanted to say for this final spray area, calculate the area of that spray area in square kilometers, I can add a field to spray area, and I can call it area square kilometers. Now this is a slightly different version of the tool that you're used to seeing. You're used to seeing it in the attribute table, but it's all the same stuff. I want to make sure it's floating point because I want decimals. Okay, all that is good. the arrow is going to connect over here. And then if I want to calculate geometry in my attributes, so slightly different name to it, but almost the same, so not too bad. And I want this to be from my spray area, so the last spray area in the line will have, or should remember that it has, an area square kilometer field in there. And I want this to be area, and I want the units to be in square kilometers. Super. So as long as you're sort of, working on the previous file that you've created, the model itself should recognize, if you want to calculate geometry, I can do that for spray area parentheses too, because that one has a new field called area in square kilometers that you can add to. Clean this up a little bit and zoom out so we can see it all. Okay, great. So now I should be able to run my model, and we'll just stand here and watch it, which is kind of fun because you can see what step it's on. And all of these are outputting into my project geodatabase. So at the end, we should be able to refresh that and see these different things. Okay, now it's working on the next buffer. We should be able to see all of the intermediate steps in the project, in my project geodatabase in this case, because that's where I saved everything as kind of temporary files. Oh, it's getting close. All right, so it's done. Did all of those 7 different steps. Let's refresh this, and now I should have these different intermediate steps in here and also my spray area, which let us go check out the spray area. Let me try to make this a little bit pinker, brighter color. I like pink. So there's my spray area that I can actually reach around the bird. And I should also see that I have this a new field called area in square kilometers, which tells me it's 1.98 square kilometers. Because this is saved inside of a geodatabase, I also have the area in, these are square meters because that's the projection, the coordinate system is in square meters. But if I wanted to be sure and I wanted to make sure it was in square kilometers, then I can add this one. Okay, so that's all well and good. Probably you could have just done all of those different steps, by yourself in about the same amount of time, right? So here is where Modelbuilder comes in pretty handy, which is, what if the CDC has now come back and said, actually, we didn't want it 2 kilometers from a dead bird. We found like that was too excessive. Now we want it to be 1.5 kilometers away from a dead bird. Okay, so if you had to do that all by hand, then you have to start over and do every single step in the process. But here, I could just say, not 2 kilometers anymore. You want 1.5 kilometers now? Okay. And one other thing that I might want to do is to just sort of change, in this case, the name of my output file to be spray area at 1.5 kilometers. And then it's not going to like that because I'm referring to something else, but what didn't you like? Oh, you didn't like the dot. Okay, it just didn't like a dot in the name of the thing, but everything else should be fine. So you can see if you hover over it that this is still operating on this spray area of 1.5 kilometers rather than the spray area originally, because all of these things are connected. Okay, so now I can go ahead and run that one. Right, so 30 seconds later or whatever, we have our new model output. Let us go back, we'll refresh this. and I should have a spray area with 1.5 kilometers, which we can then see, over here. The same, it should be the same as the pink area, just smaller inside of it. And if I open this attribute table, then I should have whatever the area in square kilometers of that one is. So if you have, a bunch of different sizes, or we're going to talk about iterators later in a future lab, which is another really nice feature in Modelbuilder. But in this case, when you're putting your lab together and looking at those like different size buffers around the camera traps, just do 5 different ones through this Modelbuilder. It's not going to take too much time. And we'll talk about iterators later on. So basically an iterator, so you've got sort of this like look ahead, is there's an insert iterators here. You can see a whole bunch of different ways that you can do it. So you could iterate through, for example, a whole folder full of XY comma separated value files or Excel files or something like that. And for each single one, you can turn those all into a shapefile and do whatever you want to the shapefile afterwards. That would be iterating through a bunch of files. You could iterate through selections too. So if, for example, when you guys, when some of you made the pie charts for the different fire categories, or the 11 different fire categories in Florida, iterating through a selection would have been a nice thing there, because then you could just set up the model and set it to run rather than doing it by hand 11 different times. You can also iterate through, shape files if you wanted to clip 50 different shape files all inside of this folder to the same area, and output them all to a different folder. Then you can tell it, look at all of these shape files, and then when you output them, just output them by the same name in a different folder. So just a heads up that we'll be doing a little bit of that later on in a future lab. But for this one, just go ahead and change the buffer size yourself so that you've got those 5 different buffers. All right, super. Thanks so much. I will see you guys in class.